All right, I think we're ready to get started. This is the first week of my spring 2021 offering of the course on Information Security Systems and Management. My name is Mike Wilkes. I'm an adjunct professor with NYU, and I'm also a CISO with Security Scorecard. And I'm going to bring up the deck in just a minute. Just so that you're aware, this format of the course is a webinar, which means that there's not a lot of interaction during the lectures. I have a lot of material to present over the next 12 weeks, and a lot of our interaction will be through the assignments and through the Slack channel. And also, of course, one of the reasons for doing it this way is to not disadvantage any students that aren't in this time zone, that might not be able to join because of perhaps religious practices, or that are on other continents and watching the courses on playback. So everyone pretty much has the same material and benefit of listening. So let me start my presentation and we'll get started. Alright, so let me double check and make sure that the audio levels look good and that I'm in presentation mode. Alright, and jumping back into Zoom real quick. Yep, audio levels look good. The right microphone input source is good, and that should be it. I see 11 participants, and I think we have maybe 19 students registered for the course this semester. The summer semester last year there were 102 students, and there were the Cyber Fellows, and so that was a slightly more in-depth course. But pretty much anyone can take this course. It's an intro level course on a wide range of topics, and I'll be going through the rest of the lecture, introducing what's going to be covered in the materials and how the course will be taught and things like that. So let me get back to the presentation. So let me just do a quick audio check. You should be able to see Week 1 Information Security and Risk Management on the screen now, correct?
Yep. Yes, sir.
Yes, that is correct.
Yes, correct. Good. I see that in the chat. Thank you, Kevin and Michael. All right, so let me get started with the pulling up the slide notes. And I can see what I intended to say. Come on, slide notes. Here we are. Make a little bit more room for them. Okay, so this is Information System Security and Management, NYU Tandon School of Engineering, January 2021. So the course has, well, not 101 students, it has 20 students enrolled, and it's going to be really fun to teach. But first, who am I? My name is Mike Wilkes, and I'm currently the CISO at a 7-year-old startup called SecurityScorecard.com. You might be saying to yourself, wait a second, that photo is a bit dated, isn't it? He doesn't look like that now. Well, you're right, of course. This photo was taken when I was preparing to move back to the US in 2013. So it was taken about 8 years ago. But of course, I'm also not this guy either, at least not yet. So I'm somewhere in between. And the question that I would ask, since you may be familiar with this Face app, it uses a sophisticated facial recognition software to produce both older and younger versions of any headshot that you might select. And there was a bit of controversy that surrounds the app when it first came out, because it's in fact a Russian startup company. But many people, they already have their headshots on LinkedIn. So it's not as if the images are private or restricted from being processed by that app. And as we get more deeply into a discussion around social media and safety in another lecture, however, suffice it to say that I'm not yet the guy on the right, but I'm well on my way there. I have 2 kids to thank for the rapid transformation from no gray to mostly gray over the last few years. Allow me to share a few stories to help you understand a little bit about me and why my experience and knowledge might be of interest to you and a reason to take this course. I have the distinguished honor of having led the DevOps team. That's not what we called it back then. We called ourselves WebOps back in the day. WebOps engineers that created the very first website for Starbucks.com in 1998. The same team also built and tested PlayStation.com for the PS2. And I also led the team that gave Macy's its first J2EE e-commerce website. And that PlayStation 2 site was in the year 2000. Let's see what else. I helped when I lived and worked in Amsterdam for 11 years. I worked on infrastructure for KLM and worked for a company that was a sole reseller of Akamai services. So I helped put KLM.com behind Akamai and helped them move from 90% offline sales to 90% online sales, and improve the caching and user experience, of course, for people in Asia Pacific, Latin America, and basically places that were not Europe. After that, one of the highlights I like to mention, moving back to the US in 2013, the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, the CME group, and I was a manager of the enterprise server platform. And so there we managed about 10,000 servers that made up the exchange, and $1 quadrillion in contracts traded in 2014. And in order to break down the number quadrillion, I thought it was interesting to make a small sidebar story. So $1 million in $100 bills will fit fairly easily in a briefcase. In fact, you need some bubble wrap in there with it so it doesn't jostle around too much. And of course, once you move up from $1 million, you reach $1 billion, and that's maybe a pallet full of $100 bills. And then once you move up from $1 billion, you get to $1 trillion. And of course, $1 billion, is a fairly large amount of money. When I worked at AQR Capital in Greenwich as a hedge fund manager, infrastructure manager, they had about $184 billion under management. And the next level up would be $1,000 billion, which gets you to $1 trillion. And now we're talking about maybe Apple's market cap, when it came out, that they had reached that $1 trillion level. And of course, $1 quadrillion is 1,000 Apple computers. So imagine, this being transacted on the platform every year in increasing amounts on the exchange. So it was what was called a SIFI, systemically important financial institution. And I certainly enjoyed the pressures, I guess, and challenges of operating the exchange. I hadn't actually focused on InfoSec yet. I was more of an infrastructure-born kind of hands-on technologist, and I've focused on InfoSec in the last 5 or 6 years. But while I was working at the CME, I had kind of gained the nickname the Gis Whisperer. GIS is a common 3-letter acronym for Global Information Security Teams, because the team was kind of known as a 5-headed Hydra, and I was whispering to each of the heads of the Hydra to help them and to help me maintain the integrity and confidentiality of the information on the exchange. What else? After the CME, I became the head of security and DevOps and enterprise architecture for Marvel Entertainment. And I like to joke it was my job to keep Iron Man safe. And so for 2 years, I was the head of InfoSec and the CISO for Marvel. And that was a great opportunity, a great experience. I highly recommend working for the Empire, because Disney bought Marvel in 2009. So there's a lot of interactions with colleagues at ESPN and Disney Plus, Lucasfilm, Pixar, Parks and Resorts, ABC Television. And so that was a really great experience that I'll tell some stories about over the course of these lectures. After that, I became the CISO at Ascap, the American Society of Composers, Authors, and Publishers. This is about a 700,000 member strong organization representing 11 or so million copyrighted works. The difference between Ascap and what you might be thinking about for streaming royalties is that Ascap pays the writers of the songs, not necessarily the people that recorded them. So in the case of Ariana Grande, we're playing and paying the people that wrote the songs that made her hits. But in the case of someone like Neil Young, he wrote his own songs and he recorded them, so he got paid the streaming royalties as well as the Ascap writers and publishers royalties. And Ascap, I was the first CISO and the first security officer in the history of the 107-year-old company. And so I got to build the information security program there from scratch. And that was great. I'm an Ascap member. I'm a musician. I play drums, jazz. And it's a great mission that they have, putting food on the table for people that create music and write music. Certainly in these difficult times, music is one of the few things that unites us, and I believe it's their craftsmanship of writing these songs that really stitches together the fabric of our society as a country and also as a race of humans around the world. Let's see, what else? Ascap had revenues of about $1.2 billion in 2019, and 90% of that was paid to the membership. So it was a not-for-profit, member-based organization. I joined Security Scorecard in August of this year, but I've been following that company since around 2015, and I purchased the solution twice. So I'm a big believer in the value that the platform offers, and Security Scorecard is a way of rating the security posture of companies without any agents, without any software. It does it all through open source intelligence, scanning what's available on the public internet about a company through its DNS records, through headers that come from servers. And so this is now an opportunity for me to learn how the sausage is made, to make the product better. And the mission of Security Scorecard is to make the world a safer place. So I definitely believe in working for organizations that have a very strong values-based mission. And one of the other things I want to mention is that Security Scorecard was nominated to the World Economic Forum to be as a technology pioneer for the next 2 years. So I'm actually participating in the Davos conferences and the working groups on cyber resilience and governance for boards of directors on how to improve the oil and gas industry as well as other industries, benchmarks for cyber resilience and for cyber security. So that's one of the reasons why my work at Security Scorecard is so relevant, because that's what the platform does. And you guys will be making some use of that in your student projects. I can give you an account so that you can run some scans and see what reports are available on the platform as a part of the coursework. Let's see, what else? Governance of cyber resilience, that was that. Okay. So this course is being taught as a webinar. Each lecture will be recorded and posted along with readings and some homework. There's a Google site. It's restricted only to NYU students and faculty and staff that I've created, and it's a resource for some additional readings, links, and information. So you'll find that in classes, NYU classes. And what else? Eclecticus. Eclecticus is my handle. Back in the days of Citizens Band Radio, or ham radio, a handle was your call name. And so I've been using Eclecticus with a Q for many years, and I own the domain name eclectic.com, for example. It's kind of funny because there's a security company in the Netherlands called Eclectic IQ, which is spelled with a TIC, eclectic, the normal spelling of eclectic. I spell it with a Q on the end, so eclectictiq.com. And I keep getting email for them. People keep sending me email thinking they're reaching them, and so I often have to forward it to them and then delete it. But anyway, typo squatting and misunderstanding of domain names is something we'll talk about in some subsequent lectures. So lectures are recorded here on Saturdays at home, working from home. Behind me you can see a photo I took of the Arch in Washington Square. And you will not be hindered, of course, by missing the lecture as it's delivered now live. You can watch them at your most convenient time. They're not going to be terribly interactive, and this is by design, as I mentioned, in order to be fair. There is an office in Metrotech, where the adjunct professors can sit and have office hours, but because of the pandemic, that's not happening right now. But I did record some of my lectures last spring, before lockdown, from room 871 in Metrotech. Right, so now the official course description. The practice of information system security is at the core of this course. All aspects of managing information security tools, processes, and teams cannot be covered in one semester. But the essentials of Praxis, Praxis, which is theory and practice combined, can and will be exercised over the course of this 12-week class. Your participation level, however, will to some degree determine just what you get out of the class. I can enthuse at you for 30 hours for 12 lectures of 2.5 hours each, but at the end of the day, the degree to which you will be inspired and engaged by this course is in your own hands. So interact with your colleagues on the Slack channels, When you do your student projects, teamwork and collaboration is an important part of that grade, and engage. If you want to be hands-off, you can be hands-off, but I think you'll get more out of it if you do ask questions and post them in the Slack channel, and get the most out of your access to each other and to me. This course will have achieved its objectives if afterwards you understand the extent and limitations of their authorities to ensure operations in cyberspace are in compliance with U.S. law, and to understand and apply moral reasoning and models to address current and emerging ethical dilemmas. More on that later. I have 2 degrees in philosophy. Computers was just a hobby that became my career. I have a master's in philosophy of education from Stanford, and so I wax philosophic during the course from time to time, and I think that's an important part of making sure that people understand security and the issues behind it. It's not just about tools and technology. The goal or objective for the course number 2, you'll be able to identify and measure quantitative and qualitatively and mitigate key information technology risks. Observation and outcome number 3, describe each of the tasks associated with risk framing, asset response and monitoring, and describe and understand the phases of incident response. Number 4, you'll be able to describe the practice of information systems security engineering. And 5, you'll understand the role of compliance with audit with regard to the design, documentation, testing, monitoring, and business continuity, planning, and automation. Readings. While there is no particular single textbook that covers most of the material in this course, it is at least one book will be used for several readings and several readings assignments. This is Ross Anderson's Security Engineering 3rd edition, and I have links to the GitHub repo, I believe, with the course materials that you need. So you don't have to buy a hard copy of this book or a soft copy of it. But if you so desire, feel free. It's an excellent book. It's in its 3rd edition. I taught the first time I taught this course, it was with the 2nd edition. Now the 3rd edition has just come out, so that's a fresh, version of the book. Your grades. Grade calculation. The course grade is based on a team project, student project, and it's not a hypothetical. It's a very real project. We're going to actually be doing security assessments for NYU. And this is also a benefit to the university, but it's also a very real-world, practical, hands-on experience for you in doing a security assessment. And then homework, the grades that you get for turning in your assignments is 40%, and class participation is the last 20%. And basically everyone gets the 20%, unless of course you just never show up again for lectures or don't show up and ask questions in Slack. So the 20% participation component is quite easy to achieve. So basically this is an easy class to pass, right? Your student projects, you're going to do the work. Your homework, it's not overly burdensome. It's a 3-credit class. So I have, I think, maybe 14 assignments or so that you have to work on. And you get partial credit for some of them, and full credit is quite easy. It's usually a 1, 2, or 3-point scoring on each of the assignments. It's pretty hard to miss getting your credit for the assignments. And lastly, your participation, like I said, is comprised of discussions on Slack and with fellow students. And when there are teaching assistants, as there was in the summer, your interaction with them is also a component. There is no midterm, and there is no final examination. So all the stress associated with those things and proctoring them and taking them and worrying about your grades, not a part of this course design. As I said, it's an online course, new lecture delivered every week. Homework assignments and reading assignments are posted in NYU classes. A student team project is required, and the team project is comprised of 6 to 8 students. I'll ask you to self-organize. So just randomly pick some people in Slack, put together a channel, create a private channel for your project, invite me to the channel so that I can see you working on it and I can answer questions you may have. And so if we have 20 or 18 students, we'll probably have 3 student teams. And you'll form yourselves and put together a project proposal, also identified in the syllabus. And then of course I'll approve the scope of work for your student project. All right, the syllabus. So let's review the syllabus a little bit so you can get a sense of what's to come. After that, we'll launch into the first topic for this week. So, introduction to the course and definition of information security. Its principles of availability, integrity, and confidentiality. You may have heard of this triad before. Some people call it the CIA, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. I actually prefer not to use that acronym, so I actually refer to it as AIC, availability, integrity, and confidentiality. These are the three pillars of InfoSec, and a lot of people focus mostly on the confidentiality aspect, privacy, secrecy, encryption, and things like that. But oftentimes, an InfoSec team will be responsible for the BCP plan, right? The business continuity planning, and the DR plan for a company. And so that's the whole availability aspect. If a denial of service attack is making a web service unavailable, it's the InfoSec team as well as the infrastructure team that work on it, and mitigating that risk and understanding it, and perhaps purchasing a DDoS scrubbing mitigation solution would usually go on the recommendation of the InfoSec team with the information systems and IS team support, of course. And one of the things I like to mention here is that risk does not actually go away. InfoSec merely reduces it in collaboration with the business, reduces it to an acceptable level of what we call residual risk. You can never make something completely safe. There's no such thing as perfect security. Security is not a state. It is a process. And so you don't suddenly become secure. You're constantly battling the challenges and threats. And the threat landscape changes quite frequently. And I'll be talking about that throughout the course. So I think we've covered that, who I am, the course intro, and what is information security at its core, those three principles, and of course, what is risk. So let's talk a little bit about that. In week 2, we're going to jumpstart your familiarity with an introduction to some of the tools and techniques of information security, and where the battle to protect users and data from bad actors takes place. It used to be the model for security to have what would be called a hard and crunchy perimeter, and to fight the battle in the DMZ, the demilitarized zone. But now, identity is the new perimeter, and identity management is at the forefront of maintaining control over data and access to data. So week 2, we'll be going deeply into this topic, looking at the people and the process and tools, identity and access management, and of course, privileged identity management. The root users, the super users, the admin users. Let's see, week 3, data classification. Data is the most valuable asset in most organizations these days. Creating data that is enriched and has business value is the core reason for many technology-based organizations. Yes, there are still many product-based organizations which have physical assets to protect, but even a company like Tiffany & Company is essentially protecting their intellectual property of the designs for their jewelry and diamond settings, and not so much the diamonds themselves. We cannot know how much security to wrap around an API or an application if we don't first agree with the business on the classification of the data. And I believe that should at least be 4 data classifications in most organizations. And the 4 that covers it for me, although there can always be more and you can get more granular, 4 is sufficient. Public, internal, confidential sensitive, and confidential restricted. Why would we put a $500 lock on a $20 bicycle? So the process of data classification is very important for us to begin InfoSec with classifying the data, because we don't know how much security to put around it, how much high availability, how much replication outside of region, for data, and how much encryption, to put, how much process, how much multi-factor authentication, for example, is needed for an app. You start with answering the question, well, what is the application's data classification? So week 3 will deal with data classification. Week 4, this is information systems engineering. A well-built information system is designed and engineered. It's not just coming into existence organically from the ground up. This week we look into legacy designs for information systems. We look at modern reference architectures that are replacing those legacy platforms. We look at configuration management and how to avoid what is called configuration drift. and the essential role that a good asset management system plays at the heart of the practice of information management. Without a good CMDB, configuration management database, filled with device information, network IP address ranges, inventory of software that's installed on the systems, then the practice of InfoSec is without the solid foundation that it requires. Week 5, red alert. All hands on deck. Light up the war room. We've got a problem. Is this an incident, or is this a false positive? Who do we need to get out of bed to investigate once the Tier 1 SOC at the Security Operations Center, after the Tier 1 SOC analysts have escalated the alert and opened an incident ticket? So incident response is fundamental to the mission of IT, and InfoSec is a special set of category of incidents within that body of possible alerts and notifications. Cybersecurity incident response is a muscle. It needs to be exercised in order to function properly. Otherwise, it will, like a muscle, atrophy. This week, week 5, we dive into one of the most exciting and interesting areas of information system security and management, that of incident response. We'll be looking at phases of incident response, looking at the NIST cybersecurity framework, the CSF, and of course ITIL v4, which is formerly an acronym for Information Technology Infrastructure Library, but now it's actually just a series of 4 letters, not so much associated with the previous acronym. Week 6, vulnerability management. We now turn our attention to trying to make sure that incidents don't happen. What can we do to avoid being pulled from our sleep in the middle of the night? Batten the hatches, shields up, and be vigilant. New security vulnerabilities are reported every day. Zero-day vulnerabilities need to be patched or otherwise mitigated as quickly as an organization is able to. A remediation matrix is normally created that outlines how quickly a severity 5 vulnerability, on a scale of 1 to 5, where 5 is critical or urgent, it needs to be addressed by the team. This becomes a measurable KPI, key performance indicator, for the SLA, Service Level Agreement, for the security program. An entire course could be taught on just this one subject, but for the moment, we'll tackle the basics and get into some of the issues which plague InfoSec teams around the world. How to manage thousands of security vulnerabilities, many of which have active exploits being directed at your infrastructure and end users every minute of every hour of every day. So we'll be talking about OS security patching, application patching, vulnerability scanning, and other related topics. Week 7 is when we go into business continuity planning, or BCP. Boom! Despite your best efforts to design, monitor, and mitigate against something disastrous happening, the unexpected will usually find a way to occur. It may not even be something that you could have prevented, like a third-party provider failing, SolarWinds, for example, or 2 service providers, since we like to try to be fault-tolerant and have redundant and highly available systems where prudent. So in the time of disaster recovery, and or the more palatable term business continuity planning, there's an event which is often called boom. And all events which happen after boom are referred to as right of boom, meaning a timeline going across the screen, or I guess if you go this way for the reverse mirror. And so there's the pre-boom, then there's the boom, and then there's the events that happen right of boom. So during week 7, this is the week that we discuss disaster planning, acts of God, and this is the actual wording used in services agreements where your vendor can claim no fault, like a hurricane, an earthquake, a flood, for example. And of course, we'll be discussing other scenarios where advanced planning and testing makes the difference between getting back to normal operations or not. Most companies lump BCP DR in with InfoSec since it addresses the availability of the systems, and large organizations will break out BCP and DR into its own team due to the scale of coordination and planning required to schedule and execute enterprise-wide BCP DR tests. But for most, this is an area that falls under the security team's purview, along with the infrastructure team providing core network, compute, and storage for the business. I used to run the BCP tests for the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. I was working here in New York out of 1 North End, and most of my team was in Chicago, but we had to follow the Sun support model with engineers in Europe and in Asia. And this was a year-round preparation for a weekend because it's a federally regulated, financial services entity. We needed to prove that we could get the CME failed over to its DR infrastructure here in New York from Chicago once a year. And so it was a massive effort. It would take several weeks leading up to the actual weekend of doing dry runs and updating documentation. And there's like a 4 to 6 person team working on it year round, just to try to make sure that those BCP tests went well. And it's fascinating. If you've never been a part of one, you get to stay up all night and work on things and be on a bridge line. You need to have a secondary bridge line or video conferencing line in case the primary one goes down, which actually happened once during one of our tests. The audio line crapped out, and so we had to fail over to the redundant conference line. Anyway, so week 7, lots of fun in avoiding winking out of existence because you never tested your fault tolerance and DR plans. Week 8, documentation and design. A picture is worth 1,000 words, as the adage goes. And this is true. One good diagram or picture of an application and how it works is simply priceless, especially when investigating an incident. But the best approach is to have pictures and words, lots of words, freshly written words, words that are reviewed and approved and published on a regular basis. Documentation is a regulatory requirement for many companies and is unquestionably deemed a good and best practice. Otherwise, you have a team of what I would call superheroes who know, basically a team of superheroes who know how to, kind of build, deploy, and support the infrastructure and the applications, but whom actually engender a high risk. Those superheroes are single points of failure, SPOFs as they're called. And that tribal knowledge, as it's called, when an organization does not have good documentation, is something that needs to be addressed by the information security team and its management. You can also avoid having a certain type of incident occur when healthy and accurate documentation habits are instilled in the team. It makes everyone's life easier. No assumptions about what scripts to run after a deployment. Document the process, and your quality of life will improve immeasurably. So this is one of my favorite lectures, actually, week 8, going into diagramming, high-level diagrams, system diagrams, data flow diagrams, otherwise known as DFDs, run books, wikis, release notes, and repositories. These are all other documentation artifacts as well. And of course, we'll be talking about threat modeling a little bit in week 8 as well. Let's see, week 9, testing and automation. Information security and the information systems that we build is about trust and confidence. Trust and confidence are earned slowly and lost quickly. All it takes is one mistake and you're back to square one, needing to regain the professional and technical respect of your colleagues and the management and the executive team. It's a tough road to walk, but thankfully we live in an era of computing and information technology where great things are possible, and without doing a lot of hard work. The effort comes actually in mastering automation and in instrumenting good monitoring and testing. With sufficiently detailed documentation and test harnesses, even the most sensitive and critical pieces of infrastructure can be hardened, patched, deployed, and tested, potentially hundreds of times a week. Certainly when we talk about continuous integration and continuous deployment, CI/CD pipelines, InfoSec should be a part of that. Getting InfoSec involved as soon as we can in the SDLC lifecycle, the software development lifecycle, is an important goal, and we'll be speaking to that throughout several of the lectures. Where was my other note here? Oh yes, potentially hundreds of times a day if you look at some of the most successful companies that have embraced infrastructure as code, software-defined networking, DevOps, and agile development. But you cannot run until you walk, and you must crawl before you can walk. All organizations are on a path towards improved automation, regardless of their current level of maturity in this area. One of the best ways to beat the challenge of a shortage of InfoSec analysts and engineers on the job market is to automate what you can and try to automate just about everything within reason. Stand on the shoulders of others and don't try to invent the wheel. Seek out good tools and frameworks that are actively maintained and part of robust communities of practitioners whether it be commercial off-the-shelf software or open source software. So we'll be talking about application testing, penetration testing, scripting, IAC, infrastructure as code, and of course DevSecOps. Although there is some, kind of, I guess, difference of opinion as to whether DevSecOps is anything different than DevOps. I'd like to believe that we don't need to make an emphasis on security by putting the sec into DevSecOps, and that DevOps ought to naturally include, security, but it doesn't always. A lot of times you see people implementing DevOps in a way where they think, oh, we can just get rid of the systems administrators. Everything becomes self-service provisioning on the cloud, one click in a console, and you can build entire application stacks. But there's many non-functional requirements that have to be kept in mind, like the availability and DR and fault tolerance, like the ability to recover from a DDoS. These things have to be architected into the platform, and they don't have to do with features and functionality. There's a particularly clever phrase that I heard at RSA 2019 in San Francisco, and I like to repeat it as often as possible. We should not be in the business of deploying security features. We should be in the business of deploying features securely. So this kind of embodies this concept of imbuing and injecting security into all aspects and disciplines: development, design, testing, QA, as well as all the other aspects, termination and decommissioning of applications and infrastructure as well. Week 10 is governance, risk, and compliance. GRC is the three-letter acronym in this case. No course on information security and risk management could be complete without discussing GRC. It's about the lawyers, the laws, and the regulations which address risk. In this lecture in Week 10, we need to take off the engineer's hat, we need to set it down, and to adopt the non-technical worldview of executive management and general counsel, the lawyers. To some extent, we'll be talking about FUD. You may have heard of this acronym, fear, uncertainty, and doubt, and how to properly address the source of FUD within an organization. We must also keep in mind that the executive management perspective is valid, regardless of its ability to be technically aligned with facts or reality. And oftentimes management is kind of floating at another level, not terribly rooted in reality, and it's our job to try to keep them tethered to the ground and to reality. The mere presence, though, of an item on the board of directors' agenda makes it a fact and makes it a reality. And the executive management team, they need to be armed with answers and plans to address those items. For regulated industries, the balance is almost absurd, where the solution to a problem of regulatory risk and penalties actually delivers more risk than the original problem itself. But this too shall pass, and you can empower both yourself and your board of directors, or regulators as the case may be, with the right information at the right time. One of the stories I like to mention here, just briefly, is that there was a breach that was disclosed at the Chicago Mercantile Exchange in, I believe, November of 2013. And I had joined in October. The breach had actually occurred that July before I joined. And without knowing anything about it, I asked for a week of log files from the affected application. And I just looked at them and analyzed them with a tool called AWStats. And the next day I went to my boss and I said, this is what I think happened. And I was looking through the logs and I could see the compromise happen. And it was the system actually hadn't been compromised. It was an in-band or inline vulnerability. It was a struts vulnerability. I'm not disclosing anything here that's not public information because this has all been released since then. And it was a struts vulnerability in the Apache struts framework for a login URL. And that login URL was overloaded with a bunch of arguments that should have been dropped basically by the web server as invalid input. But instead, it got processed, and you could actually see the script kiddies executing like cat Etsy password wget towards askjeeves.com or ask.com. And it was interesting to kind of see that it wasn't an intended human act. It was all automated. And so the compromise of it and the ability to exfiltrate data through this login URL was entirely avoidable. It could have been avoided simply by putting a length limit on anything past the login URL. Why should you be able to pass, thousands of characters of input to a login URL? Really, login URLs should have, username and some type of password or hash of a token, to log in. So no more than maybe 200, to 500 or so characters at most. That entire thing could have been avoided just by knowing how to configure the Apache web server and step away from the defaults. And so in this case, it was interesting though, because all of the Gartner Magic Quadrant consultants and incident response people came into the CME, and millions of dollars was spent on investigation and remediation. And in this case, I think that sometimes the cure is worse than the disease. All sorts of recommendations came in from these these consultants on how to improve the security of the platform, when really it was just a few configurations of Apache that had to be added that would have stopped this vulnerability. Obviously, you don't want to have an unpatched Apache struts library on your platform, but there are mitigating controls that can be implemented, not even going to the level of a WAF, a web application firewall, to stop that from happening. And so this will be the week to talk about governance, risk, and compliance. And that's why I say sometimes the cure is worse than the disease, because the solutions that were brought in by the consultants actually lowered the security of some of the systems by adding just another root similar or root privileged account in order to monitor them, aka increasing the attack surface. So we'll talk about some of the complexities of solving problems versus making them worse. Week 11. This is the week that I talk about audit and observability. In the software development, change management is the practice of reviewing and approving software builds and deployments, as well as configuration changes for various network, server, and storage infrastructure. Change control is an important component of the SDLC, as I mentioned, the software development lifecycle, or sometimes referred to as the system development lifecycle. There's typically a CAB, a change advisory board, or similar body which meets to review and approve major project initiatives and changes. In information security plays a key approver role throughout the SDLC. In a healthy and modern organization, information security plays a role at all stages, including project inception, development, and testing, and it should not, where possible, be seen as a road bump on the last stage of release, maybe from UAT, user acceptance testing environments, into the final and production environment. So this lecture in week 11 is the best time to introduce the concept of who's watching the watchers. If information security are the watchers, who's auditing the work of the information security team? Or who's auditing the work of systems administrators and other privileged account users. So we're going to touch on the idea of how to create some process and tooling which enables periodic audit of the information security team itself. Week 12, Information Security Policy. WISP, SERP, and Training and Security Awareness. WISP is the Written Information Security Policy, just another one of these acronyms that we have in the industry, and SERP, the Security Incident Response Policy or Plan. If you can't expect anyone to adhere to policies and best practices if you don't actually have them written down and published. Most organizations are required, whether by regulatory authority or for their industry or self-imposed decisions, most organizations require you to review and publish at least 2 policy documents every year. This is the WISP and the SERP. In some situations, there could be 30 or more policy documents that are broken out into specific details of information security policy, incident response, social media policy, all sorts of things about acceptable use policies, things like that. And some appointed group within the organization has to be responsible for approving the documents as official corporate policy. So this needs to be done and reviewed and approved every year. So this lecture in week 12 dives into the not so exciting world of policy documentation and the role it plays in information security management. At the end of the day, if there is an incident and you have followed your documented policies leading up to and including during that incident, then you have protected your organization to the extent possible and have achieved a defensible position with regard to regulatory penalty and potential legal or criminal litigation. All right. And then, of course, the final project. The team project, the student team project. Your team project is comprised of students of 6 to 8, 6 to 8 students, and students will form their own teams and select a project within the guidelines presented. I have a document for that for you. Team projects must be approved by the instructor, that's me, and if required, teams will be adjusted in order to ensure a balanced mixture of profiles and people. Project proposals are due the end of week 2, which is next week. Approved project proposals are due by week 3. That's me approving them. Draft project report is due in week 6. And then the draft executive presentation and slides for that readout, that executive readout, is due in week 9. One of the useful things that I've learned is that you can be a technologist and you can be an information security professional, but if you can't communicate goals and objectives and initiatives and outcomes and KPIs to the board or to the executive team, then you're going to be limited in your effectiveness, because you need to get their buy-in. You need them as stakeholders to help you accomplish the mission of protecting the organization. So one of the things I think is most valuable, besides drafting the report and writing your assessment, you will then have to do a readout, an executive readout of it, where you actually record a Zoom session and divvy up your deck that you'll create, which presents the executive level, executive summary findings from the report. And these have their way of making their way to the NYU CISO and CIO. Over the summer semester, we had 3 of the student projects presented to the executive team because they were just phenomenal. And you guys will all, I'm sure, impress me with your ability to do an assessment that is able to identify some risk in the organization within one of the schools or departments in NYU, and to publish some recommendations, come up with some recommendations on how to mitigate that risk based on what you will have learned during this course. All right, so let me pause for a second and take another drink of water. All right, so this is the beginning of the actual instruction, right? Not just an overview of the syllabus. What is information security and what is risk? So the question is, what is the core concern of information security? As I mentioned, it's availability, integrity, and confidentiality of information and data. So these are the 3 pillars that must be addressed in the development, deployment, and maintenance of information systems. Any application, service, or information system can be assigned an AIC rating. I typically do this on a 3-point scale, where 1 is low, 2 is normal, and 3 is high. So the most critical application that you would have in your application stack would be given a 3.3.3 rating. And one of the least criticals would be given a 1.1.1. An example I might think of as well would be maybe something that doesn't have a high availability requirement, but does have a high integrity and confidentiality. So that would be a 1.3.3. And in this case, you could think of maybe a non-production database. That QA database doesn't necessarily, or dev database doesn't necessarily have to be available 24/7. So you don't have fault-tolerant multiple nodes, backing up that database necessarily. But you may have, data in it that has been, sort of masked and populated from the production environment, so the integrity and confidentiality of it can still be quite high. So those are a couple of examples of AIC ratings. So let's talk about availability. An information system is not very useful if it's offline or otherwise unavailable. And this is one of the reasons why information security professionals are often tasked with supporting BCP and DR functions. Again, BCP, business continuity planning. It's more about like what we're living in right now, for example, the global pandemic. You could almost think that the whole world has been living in one tabletop exercise since March of last year when lockdown began. There would have been no other real situation where you would have discussed what if, and where the what if is, what if there was a global pandemic and everyone had to work from home? Discuss. Right? This would have been a scene or a scenario in a tabletop exercise, and we've all been living in one now since then. So we're all running BCP since then. And it was funny because last year I was in, I think it was week 7's lecture, right when the lockdown really started to take place, and so it was fortuitous that that was the topic of discussion at that time. But anyway, DR is more concerned with returning to normal operations after a sudden event like an earthquake or a hurricane, flood, and how to get back, right? Business continuity, though, is maybe a transformation of the business. There's certainly all sorts of businesses that have gone out of existence because they didn't have a BCP plan. They didn't know what to do if you couldn't have a shop with a store that people could go and visit, and restaurants that they could sit down and eat in. And so a lot of business models have pivoted and changed, and that's really the core piece of BCP. For the integrity aspect, it's an important concept to mention here, non-repudiation. In the world of information security and digital statements or assertions, the ability to have an accepted method and proof of data integrity is extremely important. One usually needs to be able to associate actions or information in logs and in systems with a unique individual. Sharing logins and borrowing someone's key card or badge, that violates this principle, right? You can repudiate or you can deny that you entered the building if you gave your badge to someone else. And so we need to make sure that we have good access management logs, video surveillance, as well as badge swipes to know who was actually in a building or in a data center at any given time. And of course, we need tools to try to make it impossible for the owner of an account to deny responsibility for actions that were taken using their account. And lastly, confidentiality, secrets, private information. This third pillar of the information security world is one that concerns itself with usually considered the area of most risk. Data breaches and disclosures, these are significant events that happen that break confidentiality. And of course, as I mentioned before, many industries identify 4 common data classifications: public, internal, confidential sensitive, and confidential restricted. An example of confidential restricted would be something that would do tremendous business and reputational damage if it became public. Confidential sensitive, this could be most of the PII that we think about, social security numbers, how much your salary is, things like that. Internal, things like email, and then public data would be things that are on your public website, or in a press release, or on a YouTube video that you posted that's open to the internet. So let's drill down into each of these 4 data classifications briefly. Information and data that's found on a website, as I mentioned, before authentication, is usually classified as low confidentiality and low risk. This data and information is meant to be shared, and it's often increases in value by being copied and shared. More examples would include, like I said, press releases, of course, once they're published, social media posts, and annual reports. It's interesting to note that data isn't always one classification forever, right? A press release, before it's published, can be critical, confidential sensitive, or even confidential restricted. I remember working at Marvel, for example. Casting announcements would go up on the website. And you don't want your casting announcement for who's going to play Captain Marvel or who's going to play Thor. Now that she's a woman, Natalie Portman is cast. This information is highly sought after, and you don't want it to be in a predictable URL, right? You don't want to use sort of a programmatic way of publishing these, because then someone could potentially find that press release or that publication, that casting announcement, prior to the date that it was actually meant to be released. And this could materially affect lots of things with people's contracts. It certainly affected, I think, Intel recently. They found out that there was a third party that had inadvertently published some of the earnings data just before the earnings call. So it was the same day kind of thing. But again, it was a predictable URL. It was a non-production environment, if I remember correctly, and it moved the market, and it changed the valuation of Intel stock. And I'm sure some people got fired because of it. So it's important to note that public information doesn't always start as a public classification, and before it's made public, it could be quite a different severity and confidentiality. Internal, this is the usual example that I mentioned, internal data, email, right? Most emails are more sensitive. Some emails are more sensitive and confidential, but in general, the day-to-day communications are mundane. And the exchange of information between employees and companies is classified as internal. The disclosure of most of this kind of information is not going to be terribly damaging. More examples would include training materials, SOPs, standard operating procedures, your address book, your contacts, things like that. You don't want them to be disclosed, and it looks bad if they are. But again, the data classification on internal doesn't require extra stringent protections. Examples of confidential sensitive. Now we're talking about semi-sensitive data such as compensation, employees, their home address. This information has to be protected from unauthorized access, but the divulgence of which is not really going to cause serious repercussions for the business and its ability to continue operations in a trusted and secure manner. I mean, look at what happened with Equifax, right? They released all of this, had all of this PII, personally identifiable information, and they looked horrible when it was breached and exfiltrated. 200 million or so, 230 million people. But they just posted one of their most profitable quarters, in the history of the company recently. So they were able to bounce back. And Sony, Sony had their huge hack from the North Koreans, and lots of dirty laundry was aired from emails and from confidential documents. But Sony's still around, and Sony's still, recovered. In fact, I think the CISO at the time went on to get paid even more money elsewhere, because he's now a battle-scarred and tried and trusted CISO. I think John Scamone, he's now the head of security, the chief security officer for Dell, and he has something on the order of 60 CISOs that report to him. I met him at RSA 2019 at a CISO bootcamp session. Really great guy, really smart. And so, it's not necessarily the end of the days if something bad happens. It matters more how quickly you respond to it and how well you respond to it. Because in these times, breaches, ransomware, it's not necessarily if it'll happen, it's a matter of just when. And finally, confidential restricted. This classification includes super sensitive information, where the exposure to unauthorized parties or individuals would generate serious repercussions with regard to brand damage, loss of data and trust, possible legal peril. Social security numbers and PCI is often included in this category. Multi-factor auth, 3 factors or greater, are often implied to this kind of information from unauthorized access. I think, again, you drawing on the Marvel example, some of the scripts and some of the data about Infinity War and Endgame were some of the most closely guarded secrets on planet Earth. Even the people in the movies didn't know what was going to happen in the movie until they were on the red carpet at the premiere watching the film for the first time. So that's certainly a lot of paranoia, a lot of digital forensics and protection around confidential restricted data, because you don't want to spoil the plot, and you don't want leaks. Even Apple has leaks about their next products, because there's so many suppliers and so many trusted parties involved, not all of which have as good security as Apple itself to keep that secret. All right, so strictly speaking, information security is not only the domain of bits and bytes. Any information system, including a 1934 multi-volume encyclopedia or a vault full of cuneiform clay tablets, can be included in the definition of an information system. So to make the point even more clearly, technology itself does not have to be limited to the digital world, though many think this is the case. If you look at the definition of the word technology, techne means art, skill, or cunning of hand, and logia means a subject of study or interest. And so technology, in this case, can be somebody drawing a really great black and white ink drawing. They can have skill and technique, and you can study that skill and technique. And so there's multiple technologies, not just digital technologies and bits and bytes and ones and zeros. And so I like to try to remember that, and this is me waxing philosophic, breaking down the word into its Greek components. But techne is a great word. I love using techne and making people understand that there's an art and a craftsmanship and a skill involved in many different areas, not just writing code and deploying infrastructure on the cloud. And so keep that broad definition of technology in mind when we talk about information systems and protecting them throughout the course. All right, tools. Tools are a necessary ingredient to an effective information security program, but they are not sufficient. Pre-breach CISOs, they tend to focus more on tools. Post-breach CISOs realize that people and process are actually far more important. All hands on deck is more of a liability during an incident if you don't have solid process in place. So make sure that your work on improving the people dimension is inclusive of the culture of the organization, because we're here trying to change mindset, right? This is just as important, if not more important, than changing the tool set. And of course, data lives at the heart of people, process, and tools. This is the typical, if you have the right people on the bus and you have the right documentation and process in place, the tools are not actually that important, or you can at least swap a lot of them out because they're quite fungible, as it's called. Modular component tools. You can use Ansible for configuration management. You can use Chef. You can use Puppet. Really, the tool doesn't matter as long as you have smart people that know how to use it and a good process defined to keep it consistent. All right, so this is called the Dkiw Pyramid. Data, information, knowledge, and wisdom. It's relevant, of course, to the discussion of information security. We definitely have to pay attention to data security. But what might the meaning of the phrase knowledge security entail, or wisdom security? Someone once said that in the information age, ignorance is a choice. And so what I'm getting at here is that data security is something that everyone pays attention to, but knowledge management and having tribal knowledge and undocumented processes is a risk as well, right, for information security, because it walks out the door when that employee is fired or when that employee quits. And so when you put the word security after each one of these, you could think of knowledge security as, what is your knowledge management? How do you ensure that the information and FAQs and runbooks are updated to keep that knowledge codified and explicit within the organization, rather than ephemeral and implicit, as in the case with tribal knowledge, as they say. Anyway, we'll be talking about that more in other lectures. I found this great visualization, and I just wanted to share it with you. This is a visualization of the Dkiw Pyramid, and it seems more successful at communication the nature of each domain, right? We cannot stop with protecting just the data. Even anonymized data can, if it's enriched with additional data, be unmasked due to things like inference. And so we don't need to know the contents of a message to gain value and insight from it, right? This is the metadata about messages. You don't necessarily need deep packet inspection on a firewall for traffic between two servers to know that something is going on. You just need to know what ports and IP addresses are being involved to know whether it's normal or an anomaly. And of course, we can make use of the metadata to learn what we need or what we want to know. And of course, insight is something that's built up over time, and then wisdom is something that builds upon insight. And then of course now there's this humorous example that someone had created, so I'll share this with you. This is an improvement on the previous drawing, and it made me laugh, but it contains some sad truth to it, right? Conspiracy theory is seeing winged unicorns in the data. Humans are really good at finding patterns that don't exist and putting them into our perception of data. Confirmation bias is a statistical fact of research. People walk up to data with a bias, with a predisposed view. And conspiracy theories are definitely running rampant in the last period. And so it's important to understand that it is a part of the Dkiw Pyramid. It's just hopefully one that we don't contribute much to. We'd prefer to be grounded in facts, I believe, in order to make progress, rather than to just simply believe in crazy conspiracy theories. All right, so you can't talk about information security without talking about SANS. SANS, Sysadmin Audit Network and Security, defines information security as information security refers to the processes and methodologies which are designed and implemented to protect print, electronic, and any other form of confidential, private, and sensitive information or data from unauthorized access, use, misuse, disclosure, destruction, modification, or disruption. So the SANS Institute has been around since 1989. And it provides great education and training materials with a large community of practitioners. But actually, I take issue with this definition and the language used here with regard to confidential or private information. Information security concerns itself with public data as well as sensitive or confidential data. Think of Wikipedia, for example. A lot of the information on Wikipedia is not confidential, right? It's publicly available. But the integrity of it is attacked constantly. Think of the edit wars that happen over various events or personalities, politicians. Barack Obama's page, Donald Trump's page on Wikipedia. There's edit wars going on every day. People trying to change the history and write-ups that are there. And of course there's Wikipedia editors and there's a community for resolution and disputes. But that's one of the reasons why I wanted to mention it, though, is that it's not just about the confidentiality of sensitive data, but also public data. We need to maintain the integrity of public data, and that's part of the mission of InfoSec. History can help us to place information security into context. Oral history, for example. Pre-literate societies had very low AIC requirements and capabilities. The integrity and availability, for that matter, of a bard's tale or an orator's speech were not strictly maintained or protected. Literacy itself was used as an information security control. Early messengers in the New World and the Old World were often selected because they were unable to read, and thus unable to read the messages which they transported from city to city and from leader to leader. This was the case in South America on the Inca Trail, as well as with runners and communication lieutenants in Old World in Europe. So it's important to realize that literacy itself was a control, and history has some great examples for us. I'd like to talk a little bit here about authorship. The power to publish, or to put it another way, authorship is a historically disruptive act. Starting with the Gutenberg Revolution, you can cast the power to publish as a fundamentally democratizing force. Movable type printing presses added to the number of publishers and added to the number of authors. It increased the diversity of opinion, and it undermined the centralized and previously unquestioned authority of kings and queens. So you have to understand that the power to publish is inherently democratizing because it's giving more people the chance to do it. It's not just scribes in a Trappist monk monastery or Trappist monk monastery that's copying the Bible letter by letter, and that made book production and distribution of books quite expensive and slow. And so the printing press obviously was a wave of revolution. And it's interesting because the first people that were living at that time weren't literate, and so it took a while for it to catch on, of course. And there's some parallels that I'll talk about with digital literacy as well. Authorship, this is the interesting parallels between pre-literate Europe and the recent period of internet literacy that come in. Books were actually originally considered to be antisocial, where the reader was engrossed in a pseudo-relationship with a virtual person, the author, and transported to the fantastic realms of the imagination. Much the same way that iPads and mobile phones were first disparaged as well for their antisocial impact with regard to one's immediate surroundings. And so I like to think about this and remember that people thinking that everyone looking down at their phone on the subway in New York and not interacting with each other anymore was dealt with the exact same way that people holding books were dealt with when books first came out, because everyone is illiterate at the time when books started up, and it took a while for that to change. So I'm just drawing some of the parallels here and saying that internet literacy and digital literacy is not entirely a new disruptive force. And I like to think that there are successive waves of democratization and authorship which have been felt with music and MP3s in the heady days of Napster and the birth of peer-to-peer file sharing. The channels of distribution were undone by the basic protocols that underpin the internet and modern telecommunications. This is one of the reasons why one of your first readings for next week is to look at a piece called A Brief History of the Internet. And yet another wave of the same revolution felt by illiterates in Gutenberg's time was experienced with the emergence of YouTube. So we can see this as being like the power to publish music, right? And no longer record labels and companies. You have Spotify, you have self-promoting agents, you have people that are internet stars that don't have an agent, that they don't have a recording label, and they're making an excellent living selling their music and cutting out the middleman. So that was a democratization of music. Obviously, Napster, people were pirating it and stealing it, but in general, until iTunes came along, people were willing to pay 99 cents for a high quality song, rather than one that they weren't so sure if it was sampled well and cleanly from the original sources back in the day. Maybe some of you aren't old as I am to have been around during the Napster heady days, but anyway, and I think of YouTube as just the next wave. And YouTube and MP3s as all being successive waves of democratization of authorship that all go back to Gutenberg and to the printing press. And I suppose the next wave of democratization will be reality, augmented reality, virtual reality. Once we democratize the power to author your own reality and to at least feel like you're living, somewhere else of your own design, whether it's an Oculus Gear or Oculus Rift or PlayStation VR. These are just the budding, first instances of this technology. And of course, authorship, at first it was just the power to author print, right? And that was followed by audio and music, and then again by video. YouTube tastemakers and celebrities have literally sprung up across the world. Here's a photo of Ryan, 8 years old when he was photographed here. He earned $22 million in 1 year, reviewing toys and performing unboxings. Now, if that's not democratization and power to the people of anyone being able to become a celebrity and to make money, doing something that they enjoy, I don't know what is. That's a great example of it. The next wave, like I said, will be the power to author's own reality. Virtual reality and augmented reality are just precursors to a more sophisticated democratization of reality. If you've ever heard of a book called The Diamond Age by Neil Stephenson, I highly recommend reading it. He's an excellent author. He wrote a book called Snow Crash, and he wrote another one, a really good one called Cryptonomicon. Anyway, excellent science fiction author. Because a lot of times science fiction is just predicting the future, right? Things that Philip K. Dick wrote, and Isaac Asimov, and all sorts of other science fiction authors have become reality for us. And so anyway, this is where individuals get to decide in what world they wish to inhabit. And in The Diamond Age, in Neil Stephenson's book, he talks about a not too distant future where you have people living in a neo-Victorian kind of enclave, where everyone dresses in sort of Renaissance fair or neo-Victorian Maker Faire kind of garb, and everyone decides that's the reality they want to live in. Other people can go back to the Wild West. Other people can go forward into the future, like Star Trek. All sorts of cosplay things are in this direction. And certainly science fiction has shown us a glimpse of that not too distant future. And of course, it's usually dystopian. They can be utopian futures, and it really depends on us as to whether whether it's going to be a dystopian future because of technology, or a completely utopian world where everyone has enough food to eat, shelter, a chance for education, access to clean water, things like that. And you can't talk about information security without talking about copyright and intellectual property. Having worked at Ascap, I've learned a lot of things about intellectual property and copyright. I won't bore you with all of them now. But I do have one quick example to give. So what does all this democratization of authorship really mean? The power to publish, right, in different mediums, including music, video, and reality. And what is the effect on copyright and intellectual property? So the ease with which information is copied and shared and distributed is always increasing. Copyright, while Disney and the House of Mouse, they put a kibosh on public domain for an additional 25 years from the initial 50-year term in the US. In 2019, we saw creative works finally re-enter the public domain from 1923. And so this was the expiration of that 25-year extension that Disney had managed to exert. And of course, this was in the effort to preserve the copyright on Mickey Mouse. George Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue, for example, entered the public domain on January 1st, 2020. And Steamboat Willie, shown here, is set to enter the public domain in the year 2024. Now, it's important to note, Steamboat Willie is not Mickey Mouse. Steamboat Willie has black hands. Mickey Mouse has white hands. And so Mickey Mouse they'll probably fight more for, but you can certainly expect Steamboat Willie to no longer be a copyright symbol they'll still be trademark, but copyright will expire. And so people can make Steamboat Willie, dolls, T-shirts, neckties, hats, and they won't have to pay Disney the copyright for it. Same kind of thing. George Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue was a song used in, I believe, United Airlines TV commercials. And the Gershwin estate, Ascap, we paid lots and lots of money to the Gershwin estate by all of the people that were using that song, right, that creative work. But as of January 1st, 2020, that entire revenue stream dried up. And the Gershwin estate, was seriously impacted by this because it was a lot of money. But they had to know it was coming, right? It couldn't be, kiboshed, for so long. Originally, like I said, 50-year term in the U.S., now 75 years. So every year, a new set of works rolls over from copyright into the public domain. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what is risk. And let's see, time check. Looks like it's 4:45. Looks like I'm going through the slides pretty quickly. And I'll be doing a little bit of InfoSec in the news probably at the end of the lecture. It's a feature I like to do where we kind of try to tie in some of the themes. I try to tie in some of the themes from the lecture with fresh news stories from the InfoSec news Slack channel that you should have subscribed to by now. So what is risk? Risk is equal, in a very basic calculation, impact times likelihood. The Wikipedia definition is risk is the potential for uncontrolled loss of something of value. When we talk about vulnerability management and risk, severity ratings in many information security tools are scaled from 1 to 5, where 5 is the most critical. Other systems, though, like the nuclear war threat levels referred to as DEFCON, and that means Defense Readiness Condition, are the reverse. DEFCON 1 is maximum alert readiness, and DEFCON 5 is for normal or peacetime readiness. So oftentimes the scales aren't the same, but taking the DEFCON example out, you can see that a high likelihood and high impact is extreme, and it earns a 5, right? And so this type of matrix is typically used to assess priorities for what vulnerabilities to go after first. You go after the Sev 5s first, right? Very likely, high impact. And then you work your way down to maybe moderate impact, but very likely, or high impact with a medium sort of level of likeliness. A lot of people talk about something called a risk-based approach. Many organizations take a holistic view on risk, and they adopt this approach. Threats are assessed, the impact and likelihood are gauged, and the priorities are established with regard to mitigations and controls that can be adopted. The problem sometimes arises, however, when we find that we're not able to rationally judge risk. And so this next slide is an interesting one, certainly since I created it before the pandemic took place. But anyway, this was somebody's slide that I found, Susanna Herdrick from 2008, reality checking device. So this one's kind of fun because it talks about perceived versus actual risk. And so the size of the circle is meant to understand that we're not good at judging risk, right? We have a whole bunch of actual risks that are low, but the perceived risk is high. And of course, the humorous example here is the zombie apocalypse. Because if you look at Google's Zeitgeist, you will find that the internet is obsessed with zombies, and for some reason it's more so than aliens, and it's more so than vampires. And of course, both of those have their spikes in TV shows and popularity as a search term. But the zombie apocalypse has some type of even alien invasions and terrorists are not considered as scary as a zombie apocalypse. And there's a couple of interesting books about this. One of them my daughter was reading for a course, an NYU course. No, it wasn't NYU. It was a United Nations course that they had offered for girls in middle school. And it talked about the geopolitics of the zombie apocalypse, and how if there were a zombie apocalypse, non-zombies would become a minority, right? A protected class almost. And all of the mechanisms and norms of society would be skewed towards zombiness. And it's interesting because, they're shuffling along. They don't move fast. They like to eat brains. They don't need to use personal hygiene products like deodorant, shampoo. They don't buy a lot of different clothes, so a lot of consumer, oriented products would fall away. And what was the other one that was mentioned? Yeah, just the moving slow thing. And of course, the joke that they made in the book was that this is a hipster culture. Hipster culture is a precursor to zombie apocalypse, and us teaching us to learn how to deal with our zombie overlords. Was this the Zombie Apocalypse Handbook, World War Z? Yeah, that was, I think it was Mel Brooks' son, I think, was the author of World War Z, and there's a great series on NPR interviewing him, talking about the pandemic and preparation and global preparation for these types of things. Fascinating topic, not for this time for me to dive into it too much, but anyway, I thought it would be funny to throw up the zombie apocalypse as being a huge perceived risk, a big bubble above the line there. All right, so risk management. Now that we know a little bit about what risk is, let's talk about risk management. We cannot hope to ever fully eliminate risk. In the world of information security, the vulnerabilities and threats, they just continue to arrive day after day. Instead, we merely strike a balance between how much residual risk the organization is willing to accept and how much it can afford to spend on security. So security and access to information, they're essentially at odds with one another. The only true secure system is one that's inaccessible. And even so-called air-gapped systems have been breached and infected. You may be familiar with the fantastic scene in one of the Mission Impossible films where he's suspended from the ventilation duct down into an air-gapped computer system and accessing it. But there's certainly real-world examples. Stuxnet, for example. The weaponized code with several 0 days that was on a USB stick eventually made its way into an air-gapped system, the systems that control the uranium enrichment facility. And so the curious individual eventually stuck the USB stick in it, and they were able to take over and control the PLCs, the programmable logic controllers from Siemens, that were used to spin up and spin down the centrifuges, but to not let them know that they were spinning them up and then spinning them down and spinning them fast and spinning them slow. Everything looked fine according to the instrumentation and controls and computer systems, but they were totally messing with their ability to make enriched uranium. And so that was an air-gapped system, and it was breached. There's a recent example of somebody using the LEDs and the lights on a keyboard to exfiltrate information from an air-gapped system through a video system. So the video camera is looking into an air-gapped, SCIF or computer information, system that's completely, tempest shielded against radio signals, all sorts of stuff. But the video camera is high enough resolution to be able to see the flashing of the lights, and it was able to exfiltrate data using kind of Morse code signals. Really great example that you can find if you search for air-gapped threats and compromises. There's also other interesting ones, where they're shining a laser on, a voice assistant like an Alexa. I won't say it because she's listening next to me right now, or Google Home, systems, where it's supersonic, as in it's above the range of human hearing, which is I think 20,000 hertz. And so it's actually speaking to the speaker coil, the microphone coil, of the voice assistant, and giving instructions through light waves, which then have a sympathetic vibration on the surface of the microphone element, and basically speak through light, the instructions to do things, on your network. Fascinating research, when people take these kind of side channel attacks to information security and management. But anyway, so even air-gapped systems can be broken into. Risk management, some industries, for better or for worse, have external regulators, which impose a large degree of control over the calculus of risk management. So there's penalties and audits and corresponding legislation which enforce compliance and adoption of best practices. Other industries, they have more leeway in choosing their path and to make preparations to weather a security incident on less stringent measures. So, scope of risk. 3 terms should be defined when we talk about the scope of a particular risk: secrecy, confidentiality, and privacy. Secrecy refers to the effect of the mechanisms used to limit the number of principals who can access the information. Confidentiality it's an obligation to protect someone else's information and organizational secrets if you know them. And then privacy, that's the ability to protect your own personal information or personal information of others. So these terms are related, but they're not interchangeable. And underlying all of them is a concept called trust. And privacy is essentially secrecy for the individual, and confidentiality is secrecy for the benefit of an organization. So that's one of the ways I like to try to tangle or tease the two terms into a relatable set of pairs, right? So privacy is related to the secrecy for the individual, and confidentiality is secrecy related to the benefit or the data of an organization. So let's talk a little about trust. If trust is at the core of information security, we need to understand what that is, and I like to define things and explore those definitions, being a philosopher. As I recall from my college math studies, all of geometry is predicated upon three assumptions: point, line, and plane. If you accept that there's no mathematical proof for them, then you can accept the logic and power of Newton's Principia Mathematica, because the entire basis of geometry and calculus is built up upon these three fundamental assumptions, which you have to kind of take for granted that they exist and that they are, meaningful, I guess. And so the entire house of cards, almost, although math I don't think of as a house of cards, but you know what I'm getting at, hopefully, is built upon these three assumptions. Trust is one of those assumptions in InfoSec, because it's hard to quantify trust. It's hard to define trust, right? You can have techniques of trust, and you can use encryption and certificates and digital signing and GPG keys, GNU Public Privacy or Privacy Guard, PGP, to encrypt and sign things, and they can be full of technical layers of non-repudiation. But eventually someone has to trust that they believe in the technique, right? The encryption algorithm and the other ways of protecting the data, and then trust the assertion that's made by someone, saying, yes, I am the author of this GPG key. You can check the fingerprint, the MD5 hash or the checksum, and then you can say, okay, I'm going to sign this key with my own key, and then you build a ring of trust, a ring of trust around assertions of identity. And so the technique is slightly separate from the concept itself. And one quick funny example that I like to digress here for a minute. When you talk about point, line, and plane, it's interesting, because if you take a line and you slice it, right, what do you get? You get a point. So you're reducing this one-dimensional object, this line, by a dimension, and you're stepping it down, right? So line, slice it, you get a point. If you take a knife and you slice a plane, you will get a line, right? You're reducing the number of dimensions by one. And so this thought experiment, or this example that I got that I really enjoyed, that I like to relay to students, is that what do you get if you slice a cube? Well, you get a plane, right? But what do you get if you slice, and a cube is a three-dimensional object. What do you get if you slice a four-dimensional object? So you take that same blade, you take that same knife, and you cut the four-dimensional object. Now, the four-dimensional object, in most cases, in most people's lexicon and parlance, you're talking about three-dimensional space plus an added dimension, time. And so what's interesting is that if you slice that four-dimensional object, a hypercube, for example, you actually get a sphere. And it's powerful, because it means that at the center of the sphere, you are equidistant to all points on the surface. And so it's an interesting shaped knife, obviously, that cuts a four-dimensional hypercube and out pops a sphere. But you've reduced the number of dimensions by one. You've gone from four-dimensional to three-dimensional. And so that helps us visualize what hyperbolic space must be like. And I have a couple of visualizations of it in one of the other lectures that came from a mathematics effort to show what it would be like to fly around in hyperbolic space, or Lobachevskian space, in a knot mathematics theory about knots and complements of knots and how they solve them. Anyway, this is all higher math stuff. I'm not terribly versed in it, but it's fascinating, because you have n-dimensional space, right? You have four-dimensional, five-dimensional. I think mathematicians are easily up to 27 dimensions of space and math that they can do now. And if you cut down 27 to 26, each one of these being cut with a knife. But it's interesting because at the center of that sphere that pops out, you're almost approaching what might be a reasonable definition of God, in the sense where you think that God is equidistant to all points in space and all points in time. And I don't know if you've watched explanations of science fiction shows and Star Trek where they talk about time-space paradox and time-space travel but I think it was Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. had an episode where they talked about how if you lived on a two-dimensional plane on a series of paper and you draw a line across the binding of that stack of papers, that line would represent time. And so for us, we wouldn't see it as a static thing. We'd see it as something that keeps moving, right? Time moves forward from the bottom of the page of the binder as you draw this black marker diagonal line towards the top page of the stack of papers. And if all we live in is in three-dimensional space, four-dimensional space looks like it moves, aka time. But if you had this omnipresent, omnipotent perspective, aka a god or godlike or Gaia, if you want to get Lovelock about it and talk about, is the Earth, have a consciousness? Does the universe have a consciousness? This same idea would apply, that you would be equidistant to all points in time, and you would be equidistant to all points in space. And just thinking about that and how the knife slices hyperbolic space, aka four-dimensional space and time, and pops out as a cube, kind of has a certain beauty to it, right, and simplicity. But anyway, I'll stop with that in case we have anyone that objects to my talking for too long about God. But certainly trust and ethics is within the domain of philosophy, so I'm within my rights, I think, to talk a little bit about it. So anyway, we have this phrase in InfoSec called trust but verify, right? By saying trust but verify, it's certainly true in information security and risk management. We can trust that the latest version of Windows Remote Desktop Protocol software is safe. But that doesn't stop us from actually verifying that the mitigation or the remediation of a vulnerability by using an authenticated scanner to confirm whether a particular security update has indeed been patched. A lot of times people just blindly trust and believe and have faith that applying a Windows update to a Windows server fixes the vulnerability. And of course, if Patch Tuesday comes out the next month and they say, oh yeah, we missed this thing, you installed the binary, you installed the package update, fixed the code, but there was a registry entry that was forgotten. And until you set this registry entry in the Windows registry from 1 to 0 or from 0 to 1, the actual mitigation doesn't work, right? And so this is something that you learn over time, is that trust but verify. Try to find a way to confirm independently whether or not a particular vulnerability exists. And then patch, and then test again, and then see if that same expression of the exploit, of the vulnerability, still happens. Because it does happen from time to time that we think we're patching things and we think we're vulnerable or not vulnerable anymore, and we still are. And so you may have to come up with an additional mitigation, blocking access to a port, making sure you're logging on it whenever anyone happens to connect to it. If you can't block it, doing an escalated alert based on that. These are some of the constructions and designs that we have to put around certain risks as they're identified, and we attempt to mitigate them. High risk quantified. So what is high risk? It's not always possible to have everyone agree on what the risks are when you have a high, right? Impact and likelihood both high. And if there are mitigating controls, then a Sev 5 might be downgraded to a Severity 4. To help us with this, the InfoSec community has developed something called CVSS. So CVSS is an acronym for Common Vulnerability Scoring System. It's an open framework for communicating the characteristics and severity of software vulnerabilities. CVSS, it does not measure risk, it measures severity. When the base metrics are assigned values by an analyst, the base CVSS equation computes to a score, basically ranging from 0.0 to 10.0, 10 being bad. CVSS version 3.1 was released in June of 2019, and it consists of 3 additional metric groups, base, temporal, and environmental. So let me see if I explain those. I think I do. So this remediation matrix is used to determine the SLA, right, the service level agreement, for the engineering team and for the infrastructure team to remediate specific CVSS scores or ratings within a specific amount of time. And for the vendor, once the vendor has actually released a fix or a patch. So we have a none, which would be 0, low, which is 0.1 to 3.9, medium covers 4.0 to 6.9, high is defined, quantified, right, as 7.0 to 8.9, and then criticals are 9.0 to 10.0. Now, typically, a remediation matrix for my organizations that I've built the security program for and other companies I've worked in, there should be no highs and no criticals at any time. And if they show up in a scan because a particular vulnerability is impacting your infrastructure, you run that software or you have that version of that code, you need to remediate them, certainly on internet-facing assets, say within 24 to 48 hours for a critical. These are like remote code execution, privilege escalation vulnerabilities that get you a CVSS score of 10. These are really, really bad stuff. You got to drop everything, patch it, or mitigate it in some fashion or another. And then, of course, highs are also awful. And then eventually we start dealing with mediums and less. And there you're starting to talk maybe 2 weeks or 30 days, depending if it's a non-production environment versus internet-facing or a non-internet-facing production environment that's kind of like intranet, like a back office kind of thing that you can hit after you're on the VPN. This is all the information that goes into these remediation matrix. So for the base score, right, this is just the intrinsic qualities of a vuln. And these are constant over time, and they're constant across user environments. So the base score doesn't matter, the base risk for the vulnerability doesn't change if you're talking production versus dev or QA. And it doesn't matter now or a year from now or a month from now. What's important though is that the temporal aspect for CVSS 3.1. It reflects the characteristics of the vulnerabilities that do change over time. An example of a factor that changes over time would be the appearance of exploit code, right? As soon as exploit code shows up, the CVSS aggregate score goes up, right? Because the temporal aspect is like, all right, this is a theoretical vulnerability that a researcher found. Now there's exploit code showing up on the internet, and people can actively exploit it, and that's going to raise the temporal aspect of the CVSS score. This is certainly the case with things like Bluekeep, which I think was a Microsoft RDP vulnerability running on port 3389 for Windows Remote Desktop Protocol. As soon as that exploit code started to show up and you could actually do remote code execution through an RDP before authentication took place, so it was a pre-authentication RCE, remote code execution vuln, that one popped it straight to CVSS score of 10. And then you have environmental aspects. So the environmental group of controls represents the characteristics of a vuln that are unique to a user's environment. The environmental metric includes 3 security requirements: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Again, CIA or AIC. These are all based on environmental because if you don't have the crown jewels in a sandbox or a dev environment, then the environmental multiplier for the risk for that vuln is lower. And let's see, here is an old slide, but still a good slide. I haven't really refreshed this since a deck that I did, but the reason why mainly is because it's still a great list of vulnerabilities worth exploring. And so I'm going to walk through this list and jump out of my slide notes for a minute and just go through some of these stories and talk about some of the vulnerabilities. So this is, of course, nowhere exhaustive, but it represents some of the interesting attacks and threats from 2019 that I presented at a CISO conference in Florida. So let me pop over to the deck. So you should be able to see this. And event stream here, a Node.js, oops, that was wrong slide. There we go, event stream. So Node.js, this was a supply chain attack, and until the SolarWinds attack of last fall, which had begun in, I think, October 2019 and even earlier, where they were putting a Trojan horse backdoor into the SolarWinds Orion software that infected maybe 18,000 or more companies, and we're still unraveling and unfolding that supply chain attack. But this was one of the biggest examples of a powerful supply chain attack prior to the SolarWinds hack. This happened in November of 2018. And event stream, and hopefully this screen remains, I may have to switch actually to sharing full screen. Let me do that just to be certain. All right. So this is the Sonatype blog that talks about the event stream attack. So event stream is a Node.js package that was compromised, and it was used to steal Bitcoin, and Bitcoin wallet were using this package. And what's interesting about this attack, let me change my brightness here for a minute. It's a little bit getting darker now. Don't need as much light. There we go. So what's interesting about this attack is that it's what might be called a sub-zero day, right? So a zero-day attack is when, or a zero-day exploit is when it's announced and there's no fix for it yet, right? And so it's being exploited, boom, that's the starting bell, right? That's the starting gun, and they're off to the races. And the reason this is called a sub-zero day attack is because the bad guys actually joined the event stream community, right? The Node package, the open source developers group. They picked up a shovel and they started doing work, right? They started helping and contributing to the project, and they actually injected the backdoor into the package. And once they saw that the package showed up on various Bitcoin wallets, they knew that they could start stealing, and they stole innumerable millions in Bitcoin. And this was NPM, 6 billion downloads per week of NPM packages. And so basically they injected a backdoor into the event stream package. And then, in the olden days, hackers used to wait to attack. They would find the vulnerability, see that it was published, and then they'd go to work. But now they're starting to obviously work to inject things. Another supply chain attack was Lenovo, or no, it was Asus. Asus live update servers had been compromised by a nation state and had been specifically crafted backdoor had been injected into the Asus live update downloads. And this meant they were targeting very specific laptops. And what was interesting is I think that they had maybe 60 specific MAC addresses, right? The machine address identifiers inside of them for the network interfaces that they were targeting. So they had infected maybe 2 million of these laptops in the Asus, the Asus live update attack, and they ignored it. They didn't install Bitcoin, they didn't install ransomware, and so you knew it was a nation state because they were going after very specific targeted laptops that they knew apparently had been sold to specific individuals and companies. So anyway, that was another example of a supply chain attack besides this one. So this article, I'll publish the slides for you later. You can find the links and read up on them. But anyway, so that was the one I also mentioned, the backdoor for 600 MAC addresses that were used in March as a part of the Asus Live update. This story is still here. Yep. Fall victim to a supply chain attack through a backdoored update. The auto update process to deliver malware. Over 1 million or 2 million had downloaded the backdoored software, but they weren't exploiting it. Asus Tech is based in Taiwan. And let's see, the live update was discovered by research from Kaspersky Lab, and there was plenty of users that had been impacted by this. And it was the security firm dubbed the attack Shadow Hammer and released white papers about it. But certainly a fascinating attack. Locker Gaga. This one, sorry, should not touch the slide. I should just click on the link. Locker Gaga was delivered via SMB, which is service message bus or something like that, right, for Windows communication. Locker Gaga took down Norsk Hydro, a large multinational manufacturer, and this was a fascinating story if you hadn't heard about it, because their systems began to malfunction, the ransomware took over, they all ran Windows, files were encrypted, services started going down, and if I remember correctly, Norsk Hydro was saved from being completely wiped out because of the fact that there was a domain controller in Nigeria or in their Nigerian office or something that was down because of a power outage, and it didn't get infected. And so they quickly got someone on a plane, flew them to Nigeria, and had them pick up the hard drive from that server and said, "Don't turn it on. It's the last copy of our Active Directory, domain forest," and it hadn't been ransomware encrypted. But all the others had been. And so I remember reading the story that followed on from this. But certainly ransomware is incredibly on the rise lately. work from home, and remote work posture has exposed a lot of people, to clicking on emails that they might not ordinarily click on, but because they're not behind a firewall, there's not a DNS firewall in front of them when they're at home. Maybe it was in the office, or there was some type of outbound, SSL proxy that was blocking requests that would, users may click on something, but if they try to go to the web page, it wouldn't resolve. But when they're at home, they don't have that benefit now of a firewall to block those requests. So now we need to have roaming DNS clients installed to implement policy on our laptops when we're all working from home or working remote. So this Locker Gaga ransomware example was a huge hit to Norsk Hydro, and this story talks a little bit about it. They had no website, no network, and it was a really difficult situation for them. But they handled it fairly well in terms of messaging, right? The worst thing you can do is to not have your messages ready to go, pre-approved by outside counsel, pre-approved by the legal internal teams prior to launching into an event and doing incident response and incident management. One of the other examples that I mentioned, Triton Malware. This was SCADA systems, similar to what I was talking about with Stuxnet. I was working in Europe at the time when Stuxnet came out, and I was building infrastructure for Nuon, a Dutch domestic energy company. And I was actually building systems that had PLCs, Siemens PLCs, and Stuxnet, had a specific serial number that they were targeting for the Iranian enrichment facilities. But these PLCs are used everywhere, and what's so insecure about IoT for SCADA systems is that oftentimes the root password, the administrator password, can't be changed. It's actually encoded and etched into the silicon, right? It's hard-coded into the chips. And so it's a real nightmare when you talk about Internet of Things and the whole world of, see, hopefully that makes that thing go away. No, that's not what I wanted. But anyway, so this example of Triton malware was a dry run, a test image, or a test run, where they actually used the SCADA systems, and this is just a picture of an industrial refinery, but they basically were able to take it over and to blow it up, and create loss of life through a software attack. And we believe that this is just them testing out their might. If we do go to war with nation states on the internet, as has been kind of declared with the SolarWinds attack, these kinds of things are going to be happening more and more, right? People are going to be destroying critical infrastructure, power plants, oil refineries, water filtration, water treatment plants. FireEye were the ones that caught this particular one. And it's interesting because the details, I think, was that the SCADA system was left in a read-write mode. If it had been left in a read-only mode, it couldn't have been hacked, it couldn't have been attacked, they couldn't have dialed up the gas and pressure and exploded a tank or something if it hadn't been left in read-write. So there's a lot of, like I said, not just tools around protecting infrastructure, there's also process and people, right? The administrators were potentially lazy and just didn't like going from read-write to read-only mode all the time, so they just left it in read-write mode all the time. I'm theorizing here as to motivation behind why it was left in read-write. But these tactics, techniques, and procedures, these TTPs, are definitely things that CISA, the Department of Homeland Security, warns about in protecting critical infrastructure, the physical infrastructure as well as the digital. And we'll be seeing lots more things coming out of Washington in the coming months related to the Cyberspace Solarium Commission and their report, which should receive bipartisan support as we head into the coming months to protect our infrastructure. Again, following on the tails of the SolarWinds attack and infiltration. A lot more attention is being played to third-party risk and to infrastructure vulnerabilities. And the Triton malware was just an example of that from April of 2019. Bluekeep, I mentioned Bluekeep. Bluekeep was, there's another tap again. Bluekeep was the Microsoft RDP vulnerability. What was fascinating for me about this was that Microsoft decided in an unprecedented move to backport the fix to Windows XP and Windows 2003, the code base for which hadn't been touched in years. And so Bluekeep, there's still Bluekeep vulnerable instances out there. If you go to Shodan and scan for it, you'll find that there's still plenty of people that haven't patched for this. Why you would have your Windows server open to the internet and running unpatched versions. But the fact that they opened up and hit Windows XP, at the time, I had it patched immediately within my organization because I knew it was going to be a big deal, right? If Microsoft was touching Windows XP code, in the year 2019 and doing a backported update for it, it meant that the potential impact was huge because there's still plenty of companies out there running Windows XP. I don't know if you've ever been to an airport and seen one of those display boards where it does a blue screen and it shows that it was running Windows XP or something on the back end. Or even some ATM machines, I think, still run Windows XP under the hood. China Telecom Bgp hijacking. This was a really good example. These are just technical stories, specific examples of risk. And the China Telecom Bgp hijacking. I don't know if you're familiar with the networking fundamentals of how BGP works. BGP is called is an abbreviation for Border Gateway Protocol. And I like it when my InfoSec team and the people I hire to it understand the basics, at least, of how the internet works. Packet switch networks, TCP, three-way handshake, things like that. It's one of my first interview questions, actually, when I phone screen people. I say, tell me the difference between TCP and UDP on a high level. And if they get it right, then we drill down and we figure out where their knowledge starts to run out. And for your benefit, TCP is a connection-oriented protocol, and UDP is connectionless or stateless. UDP is broadcast. You don't know if the packet's made it. TCP has a handshake. It has a SYN, a SYN-ACK, and an ACK packet, so that both sides acknowledge that the connection was established. And that's called the three-way handshake. But anyway, BGP is entirely based on trust. Border Gateway Protocol is for routing networks at the ASN level, so autonomous system number. Entire net blocks and network blocks and ranges of networks. Here we're talking about AS1299 for Telia, and Cogent AS174. The traffic started routing through China and then to the regular hosts, right? And so what happens is if somebody advertises a shorter route using the BGP protocol, right, the Border Gateway Protocol, the packets will go that way. Because on the internet, it's not about the shortest distance between 2 points as the crow flies, because that's physical reality, right? The geographic, spatial, kinetic space. In the digital world, network routes have to do with latency and the number of hops. And so if you do a trace route, for example, between your laptop right now and home.nyu.edu, your packets will take a particular path, right? They go through your router, through your ISP, they go through the ISP, then they go through another carrier to get to the other network provider. Eventually it reaches NYU, and then it reaches that particular instance, right? That home page for or classes or other types of endpoints, right? A specific IP address. So BGP can advertise a shorter route, and then the packets will start to go that way. And so this is called scenic routing, when packets bound from your workstation to your bank here in New York end up going through China on the way there. And so someone can do a man-in-the-middle attack and potentially decrypt weak ciphers and see that traffic and inspect it. And Bgp hijacks were first demonstrated at a DEF CON. I think it was at DEF CON 18 or something, a very long time ago. And they hijacked all of the traffic to DEF CON and ran it through one server in New York in real time and started decrypting the traffic that was weakly encrypted, that was using SSL v2 and things like that. There were weak protocols and weak ciphers. And it was freaking everyone out. And there's been Bgp hijack events like this, many of them actually. Wired magazine talked about one for a while where traffic was being routed through Belarus and Iceland. There was more recent examples of this. I can certainly find them, not just from this 2019 instance. And some people like to say that it was a typo, right? Somebody with an AS number operating a large network space and routing tables made a typo. But when you look at the numbers involved and the ASNs and the routes, it's probably not a typo. It was probably intentional. And so this is called BGP hijacking. And again, it's based on trust. There's not a lot of technology to secure BGP protocols and routes. And people monitor it and they detect it when it happens. But really it needs to be brought up to speed, because the internet was built with a lot of happy everyone's doing things, in an academic, manner. Everyone wants to share the information. No one's ever going to do anything bad with it, right? Or try to hijack. And so that's just sort of one of those emphasis and repetitions of a theme here, which is that the internet's built on a lot of assumptions and a lot of trust. And it's great. It's non-centralized, and it's a packet switch network. It can survive, the loss of major sections of network, so that they can route, through available paths and get where they need to go. If there's a cable cut, a transatlantic cable cut, or a network outage, the internet still survives, right? It's very resilient. But this resiliency and this model and design behind it. Oh yeah, it was DEF CON 16 in 2008. That's when they were hacking it, and you can find the YouTube video for that, and they'll explain it. But anyway, so fascinating examples of BGP hijacking dealing with trust and risk. Eurofins, this was a ransomware event that was paid to recover a forensics lab. And the reason I like to mention this one was because the bad guys were targeting a forensics company that was handling court cases in the UK. Who would have the time and the resources and the motivation to hit a forensics lab that was studying like blood forensics, ballistics, as well as digital forensics? Who would be interested in shutting that down, right? And having all those cases tossed out? Well, probably a criminal that was being investigated in the UK. And so they targeted Eurofins, and they got onto this large network full of Windows servers. I think it says here, yeah, they deal with over 70,000 criminal cases a year in the UK. All of those cases could easily be thrown out because the chain of custody was broken on the data, right? If the data was encrypted by ransomware, you don't know if it was modified either, right? And even if they paid the ransom and got the forensic files decrypted and could continue prosecuting the case, the evidence was tainted, essentially. And so this was a huge deal, and there's been many cases like this since, where they're targeting very specific government agencies, the courts themselves, and having these cases tossed out is really horrible for the pursuit of justice and liberty and truth. But you can imagine that the judges were pretty pissed off when they found out that Eurofins had been compromised by ransomware, because they just had to throw out the case, or at least stop prosecuting it for a while, and get new evidence to replace that which had been potentially tainted by the ransomware. What was the other one? Fascinating one here, SKS key server. This is an open PGP certificate attack. Excuse me. This is a very unusual kind of attack. Basically, they were overloading something that was never supposed to be overloaded, right? That's what hackers do. They find novel ways to break things and see how they break, and whether they fail open or fail closed. And so what's funny, though, about this one is that the story was published as a README file that we're looking at right here on a GitHub repo. And that's just a geek doing something, right? Rather than send it to a medium.com and writing an article about it, or giving it to the press and having it distributed through traditional media, they just published it here. And so they have a Creative Commons license on it. They're saying Open PGP, explaining what it is. And he's the maintainer of the GNU PG, which is GNU Privacy Guard FAQ. And he said that their actors deployed a certificate spamming attack against two high-profile contributors, Robert Hansen and Daniel Gilmore. And this attack exploited a defect in the Open PGP protocol in order to poison their certificates, basically, and just explode them so they couldn't be used. So it's kind of like a denial of service attack or denial of information attack. And so these things were designed in the 90s, right? PGP was, I think Phil Zimmerman, if I remember correctly, started PGP. And GPG is just an open source GNU project equivalent of it for doing cryptographic signatures and signing. And it's been around since, like I said, 1990, 1991. And so these, protocols didn't have some of these, attacks in mind and the vulnerabilities involved. But this one I mentioned just because it's fascinating that the whole write-up was actually a GitHub repo. And a very unique attack against InfoSec people and InfoSec tools. And then the other one that I had in my lecture or in my presentation in Florida was a Mirai botnet DDoS attack. I think this record has since been broken, but this was the largest layer 7 DDoS attack ever recorded at the time, where it hit, I think, what was the number? 1.5 terabits per second. The lowercase b here is bits instead of bytes. If it were bytes, it would be a capital B. Can you imagine having 1.5 terabits per second being thrown at you and having to stop it? Imperva operates WAFs and DDoS protections, and so they did it. They said it was it lasted for 13 days. There were 400,000 different IPs involved, and so this was a botnet attack using Mirai botted instances, and they were able to generate 100,000 requests per second, peaking at 292,000 requests per second. So there's not many websites and infrastructure that can handle this kind of attack, and it's becoming increasingly easy for script kiddies, aka people that don't actually have a lot of technical chops, to take over a botnet and to have botnets that are available as a subscription service. Right? Somebody creates a network of botted machines, like computers in university libraries, for example, are a typical example that's used, or computers in an internet cafe, or in dorms, computer science labs, whatever, things that may not have the highest level and attendance for security updates. And they can use these machines to amplify the attack, and it looks like a lot of them are originated from Brazil, and that layer 7 DDoS attacks are harder to counter. You basically have to route the traffic through a scrubber. The scrubber has to have high capacity so that the website's legitimate responses and requests can still be processed, and all of the botnet and DDoS attack traffic is discarded. And it can be very expensive to buy these services. I purchased a DDoS subscription when I was at Marvel because it was very important to protect the brand against people pointing it at it just to try to take it down. And get bragging rights in their hacker groups and forums. But this was certainly an interesting thing. I imagine the largest DDoS attack now is much higher throughput than that, and it just keeps getting worse. Right? It's like a escalation. It's a inflation. Right? Things just get more powerful. The last one I want to mention would be the Zoom vulnerability, and that was patched immediately. NYU decided not to drop Zoom when this happened. And I was very proud of that fact because there was a lot of FUD going on around Zoom and Zoom bombing. Microsoft Teams and Cisco WebEx, those could also be bombed as well. But I think it was actually probably stock price manipulation that was at the heart of the Zoom FUD, because people were really angry that they didn't have any Zoom stock, and they wanted to buy it, and they wanted to not have to pay a high price. So they published a whole bunch of articles that showed that Zoom had bad security, and that had these security holes, and all these bad things and bad defaults essentially. Zoom wasn't necessarily an insecure product, and isn't, but it had a bunch of sort of user experience cleverness that had been created. And like I said, I was proud that NYU didn't drop Zoom. This is a Bruce Schneier article on it. Schneier.com. This is one of the feeds for our InfoSec News Slack channel. Anything published on here, this is Bruce over here on the right with the beard and hat. He's sort of a go-to figure if you've not seen him in some of your classes, if you haven't taken any cryptography classes yet, but you'll know him. He's very much of a go-to spokesperson on things regarding cryptography. His book, Applied Cryptography, is a status, a core text on the subject. And it was interesting that there was this built-in web server that was built into Zoom. And it had a way of getting around CORS, one of the security protocols for web pages, and it was all intended from the product management and product designer's point of view to make the user experience better for the users. aka they didn't have to hit OK, yes, I approve, open my camera, let it use the microphone every time they started up a Zoom conference. And so it was meant to be a usability improvement, and it was. People love Zoom. And with lockdown, millions and millions of people started using Zoom, way more than was their market share and customer base at the time. and they had to scale very quickly. But obviously people started paying much more close attention to what it was doing. And so it was actually running a little local web server that was insecure, that could be exploited, in order to pass configurations into the client and keep things up to date. What was interesting about this example is that not only was it caught and discovered and then complained about, I believe it was the CTO for Zoom. He went onto a Reddit Ask Me Anything, an AMA session, the next day or 2 days later. And he got and heard, the outrage and the how dare you, create a local web listener on a particular port. I forget what port it was, and do this to us and create vulnerabilities on our machines just because we're using your Zoom software. And so it was interesting that he, fixed it like almost the next day. Apple fixed it as well by doing an uninstall of that particular web instance and putting it out and porting it as a quick release, a very, what's called a hot fix. And people wrote shell scripts, to help take this web server listener out, because it wasn't necessary. It was just sort of a nice to have that, the product team had come up with, in the interest of usability. And a couple of those bad defaults, had been called out. But in general, the technology behind Zoom, I think, is pretty strong. They hired a very smart guy to help run their security operation. And it was, I think, anyway, they've rehabilitated their image a bit. Although there have been some, claims of censorship in China related to people working in Zoom and spying on people's, meetings there. But that was certainly not corporate policy, I presume. I presume that was an individual acting from a privileged role to do that, if I remember correctly. But anyway, so that was one of the other stories that was fascinating. And of course, NYU didn't fall for the FUD. They just wanted to publish better defaults, right? Putting a passcode on meetings. What else? Not having people automatically be able to share video. There were all sorts of controls that were non-default that could be implemented to protect us from Zoom bombers and people spewing racist rants, in meetings with our students and our children in their public schools at New York and other places, of course, all using Zoom with the lockdown and the things that happened. Anyway, so that was just a quick example of some of the risks that were from the news. We will be going into them every week and sampling some of them, and I think I'll move into a couple of them now after I finish the last couple of slides. What's another risk? Financial risk. And so in this case, GDPR. 56 million euros was levied in fines in the first year across 90,000 separate breach notifications. GDPR is the General Data Protection Regulation for European citizens. And nearly 50 million of that came from one French data protection authority, CNIL, that they levied against, if I remember correctly, it was Google. In the second year of GDPR, saw an increase by 66%, according to Linkslater's analysis in June of 2020. And that hadn't even finished out the whole year, with fines in 2020 exceeding 170 million euros. So if you think that GDPR retooling of a company's data model and their security controls wasn't a concern because you're US-based, think again. Many copycat laws like CCPA and NYPA are about to hit the books, and many states have created explicit breach notification challenges and changes. And my notes here, what else did I have to say? Just what GDPR stands for. And then the last slide that I have for you is, or at least, this is the last slide, has to do with a table of notification requirements for breach notifications. So this information is hard to compile, so I compiled it and I've been sharing it with other CISOs and others. Some states, like Connecticut, have a 90-day breach notification when you have a certain number of users in your breach and in your incident that are Connecticut residents. 60-day for Delaware, Louisiana, and South Dakota. 45-day has a slew of states. 30 days, 14 days. Alabama has a 10-day. Minnesota has a 48-hour. 24-hour breach notification requirements in Georgia, Idaho, and Indiana. But most of them just go for a very difficult to define without reasonable delay or without unreasonable delay. And so that's where the bulk of states are right now. And that's interesting because you have to declare something a breach before you start the meter ticking. And in a lot of times, you could be going 72 hours or more, which is the GDPR notification requirement for 72 hours. But you haven't declared a breach yet, right? You're still investigating an incident. And so lawyers and InfoSec professionals and IT teams are very careful about using the word breach and when to declare a breach, because the meter starts ticking on notification requirements. So a lot of times they'll spend several days or weeks or months even investigating an incident before declaring it a breach in order to avoid the reporting requirements as published like this. So that's it for the slides that I had. And so what I like to do now, since I'm doing full screen share, is to jump over to the Slack channel and just review some of the InfoSec in the News channel stories, and pull up a couple of them that sort of reinforce some of the themes that we had in this week's lecture. And so as we go through each week's topic, I'll skip over stories because they don't sort of reinforce, or they're not an example of the discussion. And of course in week 1 we talked about the whole syllabus, so pretty much all of these stories are interesting. And the reason I want to do this is not just to read the news back at you, but to sort of show how an InfoSec or CISO or an InfoSec professional might be called out to pay attention to this story. What might be the impact for you? What questions might you have to ask to decide whether or not this story is relevant for your company? So let's see. Beware malicious Home Depot ad gets top spot in Google search. So that sounds like someone gaming Google's search algorithms to show up as a sponsored ad. And you shouldn't click on it, obviously, because there's going to be scams involved there. If I open this link real quick, this was from today, January 30th. Home Depot advertising campaign is redirect Google search visitors to tech support scams. Malicious Google search ads are nothing new. Let's see. It looks like legitimate campaigns, including showing their standard URL if you hover over them. It's common for people to be tricked into clicking on them. Yesterday, Bleeping Computer was notified of someone who fell for a malicious Home Depot advertisement currently displayed in the top spot. As a test, they searched for Home Depot and they were shown the malicious ad on their first try. Even worse, the ad is the top spot in the research in this result, making it more likely to be clicked. As you can see below, the ad states that it's for homedepot.com. Hovering over it shows that the site's legitimate URL. However, when visitors clicked on the ad, they're redirected through various ad services until eventually they're redirected to a tech support scam. Call support now.ml. What is ML? Top level country code. ML is Mali. Let's see. So we're back at the Slack article. So that's one quick example of people confusing you and getting you to click on those links. UK Research Innovation suffers ransomware attack. We talked about ransomware attacks. And it's dealing with a ransomware incident that encrypted data and impacted 2 of its services that offered information to subscribers. So what I like to look for in here, if I open this link, is signs that they had a response, right? That they had an official response. Because if you don't publish it as the victim of the ransomware attack, the internet is going to write the narrative for you, and they're not going to be terribly sympathetic, right, to your company. And so if you're working for a company and you haven't prepared a statement ahead of time of what to do when and if a ransomware attack lands, then you're going to miss the boat on owning and controlling the narrative. And so you need to have those articles, those press releases ready to go and approved by outside counsel, approved by legal. You don't want someone just sort of writing one on the fly in the middle of the night while they're also trying to deal with a ransomware incident. So this says UK Research is dealing with a ransomware incident. It's a public body of the government of the UK with a budget of more than £6 billion. They should have had better ransomware protections. Obviously, backups are your #1 mitigation to ransomware, because then you don't have to pay the ransom. But paying the ransom is increasingly common because yeah, oftentimes it's the cheapest way to get back into business. And although you don't know the bad guys have left the platform and how did they get there, they do have a bit of an honor among thieves code, kind of like a Yelp system for ransomware. And so they have reputations that they need to maintain. So they will give you the decryption keys if it is a pure ransomware play. But there's also what are called wiper ransomwares, which delete and destroy your data, and they try to get paid, right? And then there's ones that don't decrypt your data even after you get paid. And so those are burning their reputation, but potentially getting a lot more money from their victims. Anyway, given the funds it works with, the agency is an attractive target for big game ransomware gangs. So that's like what they call whaling, right? When you're fishing after a large entity. Lawyers and banks and federal depositories and things are definitely targets these days. Let's see, the disclosure is scarce in details about the attack. We have reported the incident to the National Crime Agency, right? So basically they've put out like a one-sentence blurb, right? Saying that they've done their due diligence, they've reported it to an investigation. You're not going to give away a lot of details about who you've brought in, potentially a third-party incident response security provider like FireEye or CrowdStrike or Dell SecureWorks or something like that. But you do want to at least own the fact that you're aware of it, you've disclosed it, and you're working on remediating it. Typically, you have to buy identity protection, for several years for the impacted users. What else? Ukero subscription service has 13,000 users, and the hackers may have taken data belonging to them, non-sensitive personal information. The agency cannot confirm this is a fact until the assessment of the incident completes. So this is sort of a precursor to a breach announcement, I guess. So that's one story. What else? Machine learning offers fresh approach to tackling SQL injection vulnerabilities. I'm not going to click on that one now. We're going to talk about SQL injection and specific exploits and how vulnerabilities work. There's full courses, of course, dedicated just to that topic. Kerberos Credential Thievery Compendium. Interesting. Kerberos are magic tickets used in Windows systems and Unix systems for authorizing users and tasks and processes. I won't click on that one. Let's see, we have about 15 minutes left. I can go through a couple more stories in the news that are interesting for us to unpack. Transforming information security to secure businesses. That's from the CIS, Center for Internet Security article from their blog. You can check that one out. Let's see what else. Avast Hacker Archives Episode 2, Katie Musuris, I think is how you pronounce her name. She's very well known, a super celebrity in the area. So let's see, hosted by Avast CISO Jay Ballou, the Avast Hacker Archives series showcases valuable aha moments achieved by white hackers and researchers. That's a good story. I suggest checking it out. One thing I would mention just as an anecdote about Avast. Avast is kind of like a pirate phrase, right? Avast ye scurvy dogs. Avast actually is a morph of a Dutch phrase, because in the early days of pirates on the high seas, the Dutch were a global maritime power. It actually is a contraction of hou fast, which means hold on, because you're about to enter into a hurricane or storm or something. So avast means hold on, essentially in Dutch. And so sometimes I like to unpack words that I know from Dutch and other languages to explain how they evolved and are used and why Avast Security was probably named that way. Let's see. Phonics Cryptor ransomware gang releases master decryption key. This is unusual. This doesn't happen every day. This is basically a source of revenue for a gang, right? And they're claiming to shut down and deleting their ransomware source code and releasing the master decryption key. So if people got hit with this particular cryptor ransomware, today on Twitter, they've decided to shut down operation. I'm not sure why. I guess they made enough money and they've retired. Who knows? But as a gesture of goodwill towards past victims, they also released the package containing the decryption tool, how-to instructions, and the master decryption key. So that's fascinating. That's unusual kind of behavior. The Better Decryptor, let's see, a Better Decryptor currently works at Emisoft and is expected to be released next week. Obviously, people can fork the code and continue on without this particular gang maintaining it. But certainly a fascinating development. Prior to shutting down, the gang has been active since at least June 2020. A Russian security researcher who's been tracking the ransomware strain on his personal blog for the last few years. Currently, all signs point to the fact that the gang is serious about their plans to shut down. Could be disinformation. Maybe there's a backdoor involved in some sites that look like they're giving you access to the tool to decrypt. You never know. Always good to develop a degree of skepticism about what's happening. If something's too good to be true, it's probably too good to be true. So this story is being covered in multiple places. Bleeping computer. Let's see. Deploying Duo RDP through GPO can leave your secret key exposed. Great story there, but not one I'll pick up on right now. After snags, Florida launches vaccination website. This one I'm covering from State Scoop, right? And so this InfoSec news channel here is subscribed to a series of channels. So if I say feed list, I believe. No. So these are all of the RSS feeds that I subscribe to for the course, so that we have fresh news to discuss every time we have a lecture, so that you can go there and learn what it's like to keep your finger on the pulse of InfoSec news. You don't have to read all of the stories. They will sort of surface on their own. So right here, this is the Bruce Schneier security blog. We've got an RSS feed here from Security Week, Cisco's security blog. This is the Avast antivirus feed. And so this is basically something I set up pretty much in all the companies I go work in order to just build an interesting channel for news. There's not a lot of ads. I don't have to remember which sites to go look at. If I see a story pop on multiple of these sites, then I know that it's gaining a lot of attention. CIS, Center for Internet Security. What else do we have on here? Multi-state information sharing, the MSISAC blog. And so this is where these stories are all coming from. And so let's scroll up and find a couple more that maybe are interesting to week 1 topics. So that was vaccinations. Oh, I subscribe to State Scoop just because there's lots of interesting work happening at the state level. Government, federal level have been quiet for a while on cybersecurity, but it'll be picking up again now. Let's see. It's My Data stops e-commerce sites from abusing your personal valuable data. This is an interesting trend. Trying to flip the tables, right? Oftentimes a free service on the internet like Gmail or Facebook, you are the product, right? Your metadata, your browsing history, your likes, all of that data is very valuable, and it's bought and sold. But some trends right now on the internet are trying to put you back in control of your metadata and the data about you, and to give people insight and control over what is shared about them, where and how. And I think one of those is a project that Tim Berners-Lee started. He was one of the people that started the whole World Wide Web protocol, HTTP and hyperlinks. And he's now Sir Tim Berners-Lee because he's a knighted Sir by the Crown of England. And what is the name of his operation? I think it's called Inrupt. Yeah, Inrupt is the process of trying to change the whole world and connect their data. And this is the product. And what is the story behind it? I think they have like an about page. Yeah. Inrupt comes from Sir Tim Berners-Lee, and they want to try to flip the entire paradigm of who owns what data and put people in charge of their own data. And so this is an effort to work on that. So you have a director, CTO and co-founder. Bruce Schneier is involved. Other directors. What else? Worldwide team of people. And there's some folks at NYU that are involved in Inrupt as well. So you may see them discussing some of these topics and themes about how to make the world a better place. Because the internet didn't exactly turn out as the beautiful garden of pure knowledge sharing, right? It turned into a bit of an echo chamber for conspiracy theories and for communities to form. That's true, but some of those communities are falling outside of the fold of truth and facts and knowledge. That was not the intent. Anyway, so that's one theme that I wanted to mention there for that story. This week in ransomware, striking back. Offensive security is an interesting concept, at least That's what striking back sounds like to me. What can you do to have an offensive security posture in your organization and not just be passive, defensive, and reactive? Hacking back is not recommended. If you piss off the hackers, they'll come after you, I'm sure, with even more amplified payback. But there are certain things you can do that are maybe not necessarily offensive security, but that are non-passive, meaning you're preparing for an event ahead of time, right? And so you're taking an active role in mitigating the risk of harm, because that's essentially what InfoSec is trying to do if you want to put it in a positive, not just say keep the hackers out, because it's an asymmetric battle that we have with them. All they have to do is get in once, and as defenders of infrastructure, we have to win all the time in order to keep the infrastructure from being compromised. WordPress, pop-up builder, plugin flaw plagues 200,000 sites. We'll talk about WordPress and vulnerabilities in another lecture. WordPress is very popular, and it has a good 12 to 15 critical vulnerabilities released every year for it, that are published every year. And that is horrible, right? People install a plugin, you don't have a security person, you just have an empowered webmaster, right, and content team. And they want some functionality, and that functionality is not being reviewed for security. So in this case, a pop-up builder flaw hits 200,000 sites. This is from ThreatPost. This is the kind of thing that you have to try to mitigate, right? You can't just say no to the business and say, no, you can't build a WordPress site. But maybe you don't want to run it yourself, right? Maybe you want to do a third-party hosted WordPress where they patch and update it for you. And then you review which plugins are being used, and don't use ones that are low versions. This one looks like it was 3.7 was affected by vulnerability. The fix for it is in 3.7.2, and the latest version is 3.7.3. So how do you keep up with your vulnerability management? We will talk about that in a subsequent lecture. But anyway, this is thousands of sites. You can see which version of the plugin that they're running, because the plugins have very static kind of pathing. There's tools out there, WP Scan, I believe it's called, which is part of the Kali Linux distribution. That's a tool I've used as well many times to review the security of a website. It's a pen testing tool. We'll talk about that when we do security. I think that's week 5, if I remember correctly. It scans the WordPress site for vulnerabilities, passively identifying which modules may be out of date or if the entire version is behind. All right, what else besides WordPress, the bane of many InfoSec people's existence? Microsoft 365 becomes a haven for BEC innovation. BEC, this is a good one to follow up on. BEC is business email compromise. And O365, or Microsoft Azure, Microsoft Exchange Online, Office Online, is just a wonderful breeding ground for lots of bad guys to do bad things. Why? Because the top-level domain is trusted, right? They're running insecure code on a cloud service provider, or malicious code. So let's see, these two new phishing attacks. I read this one, and this is a good story. Use the platform's automated responses to evade email filters. So these are two, well, quote-unquote, fresh tactics. So basically, the first one, return to sender read receipts. So in the read receipts attack, a scammer creates an extortion email. Maybe it sends you an email with a PDF, and they name the PDF for one of your passwords, right? That was part of a breach data set for a third party that didn't protect your infrastructure very well. Dark web kind of mining of usernames and passwords. And so that freaks you out, right? Because you see a PDF attached to an email that has like a password that you used as the subject, or the name of the file actually. And then, of course, they extort you or threaten you and say, oh, we turned on your camera and we have dirty pictures of you, that were taken surreptitiously or something. So that freaks people out, right? That's the call to action. That's what these scammers and phishers are trying to do. And what they've done here, though, besides creating the extortion mail, they're manipulating a header called the disposition notification to header to generate a read receipt notification. The malicious email itself could be trapped and blocked, but the read receipt is sent to the target anyway. And because it's generated internally by O365, it's not even parsed for being malicious. And so the read receipt notification pops, and it says your message, blah, 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 was deleted without being read. It's still delivering the message. It's still delivering the payload. It's still giving a link for someone to click on. And so these fear-based attacks are abusing some of the headers on O365. The other one, and this was interesting, I had a variant of this that I saw myself, and I'll talk about it in just a second. Out of the office attack. So the cyber criminal creates a business email compromise that impersonates someone, and they change the reply to header. And so the reply to header gets bounced and again sent internally, and it doesn't get parsed as anti-spam, anti-malware. So the original bad email may not show up. In this case, the one I remember seeing was an out-of-office reply that included a WordPress URL in a hyperlink. And so basically this is a hygiene for offboarding of users. The user hadn't been offboarded, or they had been offboarded, but the account hadn't been turned off. And so I saw an email show up because the heuristics and the behavioral analytics will show that this was a clean email with a real person, a third party, a vendor you've worked with. Their email got compromised. And they didn't start spamming from it and sending out phishing emails from it. Instead, they put malware and a URL in the malware in the out-of-office reply. So it waited for you to email that person, right? And maybe you haven't emailed them for a month or two, and they're gone. But you email them saying, hey, do you still want to renew your contract with us or something? And the out-of-office reply contains the payload. And so that was a fascinating variant of that, of what we're seeing here, right? Business email compromise and ways to circumvent anti-spam and phishing and malware by generating an email that's internally trusted and essentially given free reign to show up in the target user's mailbox. All right, so that's just a couple of news from the day, and that takes us to top of the hour, 6 o'clock. I'm going to stop my share, and I see we still have 10, 11 participants. That's great. Thank you for sticking through the entire lecture in person, in real time. Hopefully, you are glad that you're taking this course. I'm certainly happy to continue sharing my experience and telling stories and putting it into context as to how the practice of information security can be learned and systems can be designed and managed and improved through attention to these kinds of topics. So with that, I will stop the recording, and I'll look for you in the Slack channel. Send me an email if you have any questions. Your first assignment is due, I think, midnight tomorrow, which is basically sign up to the Slack channel, post something in the random channel, and that way you get all 3 points, right? So first is sign up for Slack, 2 is post something in random, and 3, I think, is change your profile photo. So it's an easy 3-point assignment, just because I want to build, this water cooler community of discussion among the students and with myself on the Slack channel. So we'll see you next week. If you have any questions, you can always email me, mwilks@nyu.edu, and we'll talk to you again next week. Cheers.
Thank you.